If you're listening to this, the VOD that is, I am going to be reading a book as the title may suggest. I do hope you enjoy it, and I don't know what I'm going to read just yet, but I think it'll be, let's see here, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. I do hope you enjoy it, darling. There. There. Hello. Let's get started. It is page 261. Good. Asses for use. Oh, yes, I had to turn off emo only. Oh, thank you, Shmuel. Here, Darwin, for doing that. If there's any triggers you want me to say, Shmuel, just say them. Okay. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, written 1895. The time traveler, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding to recondite matters to us. His grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. The fire burned brightly, and the soft radiance of the incandescent lights in the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. Our chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon. And there was that luxurious after dinner atmosphere, when thought roams gracious or gracefully free of the trammels of precision. And he put it to us in this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger, as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought of it, and his fecundity. That is a word I have not said in years. Oh, hello, Kato Momi. I'm gonna be honest, on your name is not something I pronounce regularly. In my mind, at least, I say it quite a lot, but verbally, not so much. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to convert one or two ideas that are most universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on misconception. It is not that rather large thing to expect us to begin upon, said Philby, an argumentative person with red hair. I do not mean to ask you to accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You will know, of course, that a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. They tell you that? Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. That's all right, said the psychologist. Nor having only length, breadth, and thickness can a cube have real existence. Therefore said Philby, of course a solid body may exist. All real things, he was interrupted. So must people think, but wait a moment, and can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Clearly, the time traveler proceeded. Any real body must have extension in four directions. It must have breadth, or length, breadth, thickness, and duration. But through a natural infirmity of the flesh, which I will explain to you in a moment, we will incline to overlook this fact. There are really four dimensions: three, which we call three planes of space, and a fourth, time. Therefore, there is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former three dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousnesses move intermittently in one direction along the ladder, from the beginning to the end of our lives. That, said a very young man, making spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp, that, very clear indeed. Now, it is very remarkable that this is so extensively overlooked, continued the time traveler, with a slight accession of cheerfulness. Really, this is what is meant by the fourth dimension. For some people, or though some people, who talk about the fourth dimension do not know what they mean. It is only another way of looking at time. There is no difference between time and any of the three dimensions of space, except for that our consciousness move along it. But some foolish people have gotten hold of the wrong idea, or the wrong side of that idea. You all have heard what they have to say about this fourth dimension. I have not said the provincial mayor. It is simply this, that space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having three dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to three planes, each at right angles to the others. But some philosophical people have been asking why three dimensions particularly. Why not another dimension at right angles to the other three? And have even tried to construct a four-dimension geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. You know how on a flat surface which only has two dimensions, we can represent a figure of three-dimensional solid, and similarly they think that by models of three dimensions, they could represent one of four. If they could master the perspective of the thing, see? They could master perspective of the thing, see? That's what I just read. I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows, he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in a quite transitory manner. Well, I do not mind telling you, I have been at work upon this geometry of four dimensions for some time. Some of my results are curious. For instance, there is a portrait of a man at 8 years old, another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. All of these are evidently sections, as it were, three-dimensional representations of his four-dimensional being, which are fixed and unaltered thing. Scientific people, proceeded the time traveler, after a pause required for the proper assimilation of this, know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here is a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. This line I trace with my fingers shows the movement of the barometer. Yesterday it was so high, yesterday night it fell. Then this morning it rose again, and so gently upward to here. Surely the mercury did not trace this line in any of the dimensions of space generally recognized, but it traced such a line, and that line, therefore, we must concede, was along the time dimension. But, said the medical man, staring hard at a coal in the fire, if time is only of a fourth dimension space, why is it, and why has it always been regarded as something different? And why cannot we move in time as we move about in other dimensions of space? The time traveler smiled. Are you sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we go, forward and freely enough. Men have always done so, I admit. We move freely in 2 dimensions. But how about up and down? Gravitation limits. Next page. Not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons, but before balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still, they could move a little up and down, said the medical man. Easier, far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. Ah, welcome, Pluto. Oh, good to hear, Sabrina. I do want you to sleep. In this case, Pluto Hunt, I'm reading a book. It is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Please do enjoy yourself and just sit here and relax as I read this to you. Let me just find out where I was first. Oh, was a page. Far easier down than up. And you cannot move at all in time. You cannot get away from the present moment. My dear sir, that is just where you are wrong. That is where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave. Just as we could travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty is this, interrupted the psychologist. Mind you, it's one of the characters who is only mentioned about once or twice. You cannot move about in all dimensions of space, but you cannot move about in time. This is a germ of my great discovery, but you are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time, for instance. If I am recalling the instant very vividly, I go back to the instant of its occurrence. I become absent-minded, as you say. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has a stain 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon. And why should he not hope ultimately he may not be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimension, or even turn about and accelerate and travel the other way? Oh, this, began Philby, is all. Why not? Said the time traveler. It's against reason, says Philby. What reason? Said the time traveler. You can show black as white by argument, said Philby, but you can never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveler. But now you begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine to travel for time, exclaimed the very young man. That shall travel indifferently, in any direction of space and time, as a driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. But I have experimental verification, said the time traveler. It would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. Don't you think it would attract attention, said the medical man. Our ancestors had no great tolerances for anarchisms, I believe the word is. It's a bit difficult and one I tend not to pronounce, or say really. One might get to Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato, the very young man thought. In which case, it would certainly plow you to the little go. The German scholars have improved Greek so much. Then there is in the future, said the very young man. Just think. One might invest all of one's money, leave it to accumulate at interest, and hurry on ahead. To discover a society, said I, erected in a strictly communistic way. My basis. Of all wild, extravagant theories, began the psychologist. Yes, so it seemed to me, so I never talked of it until experimental verification, I cried. You are going to verify that, aren't you? The experiment, cried Philby, who was getting brain weary. Let's see your experiment anyhow, said the psychologist. Oh, it's all humbug, you know. The time traveler smiled around at us. Then, still smiling faintly, and with his hands deep in his trouser pockets, he walked, slowly passing out of the room, and we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passageway to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. I wonder what he's got. At some sleight of hand trick or other, said the medical man, and Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he had seen in Bruxelles. Never said that before. But before he had finished his preface, the time traveler came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. The thing the time traveler held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework, scarcely larger than a small clock, and very delicately made. There was ivory in it, and some transparent crystalline substance. And now that I must explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. He took one of the small octagonal tables that were scattered about the room and set it in front of the fire with two legs and the hearth rung. On this table he placed a mechanism. Then he drew his chair and sat down. The only other object on this table was a small shaded lamp. The bright light which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about. Don't mind me as I drink some tea later on. An Arnold Palmer, if you're curious. The bright light of which fell upon the model. There were also perhaps a dozen candles about, two brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several in sconces, so that the room was brilliantly illuminated. I sat in the low armchair nearest to the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveler and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile from the right, the psychologist from the left, and the very young man stood behind the psychologist. We were all on alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived, and however adroitly done, could have been played upon us under these conditions. The time traveler looked at us, and then at the mechanism. Well, said the psychologist. This little affair, said the time traveler, resting his eyebrows upon the table and pressing his hands together above the apparatus, is only a model. It is my plan for a time machine to travel through time. You'll notice that it looks singularly askew, and that there is an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it was in some way unreal. He pointed to the part with his finger. Also, here is one little white lever, and here is another. The medical man got up out of his chair and peered into the thing. It's beautifully made, he said. It took 2 years to make, retorted the time traveler. Then, when we all had imitated the action of the medical man, he said, now I want you to clearly understand that this lever being pressed over sends the machine gilding into the future, and that this other reverses the motion. This saddle represents the seat of the time machine. Presently, I'm going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It'll vanish, pass into future time, and disappear. Have a good look at the thing. Look at the table too, and satisfy yourselves. There is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model, and I have, and then be told I'm a quack. There was a minute's pause, perhaps. The psychologist seemed about to speak to me, but changed his mind. Then the time traveler put his finger towards the lever. No, he said suddenly. Lend me your hand. And turning to the psychologist, he took the individual's hand in his own and told him to put out his forefinger. So it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the time traveler, or the model time machine, on its interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn. I am absolutely certain there's no trickery, and there was a breath of wind. The lamp flame jumped. One of the candles on the mantel was blown out, and the little machine suddenly swung round, became indistinct, and was seen as a ghost for a second, perhaps, and as an eddy of faintly glittering brass and ivory. And it was gone, vanished, save for the lamp. The table was bare. Everyone was silent for a minute. Then Philby said he was damned. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. At that, the time traveler laughed cheerfully. Well, he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. Then, getting up, he went to a tobacco jar at the mantel, and with his back to us began to fill his pipe. We stared at each other. Look here, said the medical man. Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that machine, double that it figures, has traveled into time? Certainly, said the time traveler, stooping to a light to spill at the fire. He turned, lighting his pipe, to look at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show that he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there. He indicated the laboratory. And when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. You mean to say that the machine has traveled into the future, said Philby. Into the future or to the past? I don't know for certain. No, which, after an interval, the psychologist had an impression. It must have gone into the past if it has gone anywhere, he said. Why, said the time traveler. Because I presume that it has not moved in space, and that if it traveled into the future, it would still be here at this time, since it must have moved, or it must have traveled through this time. But, I said, if it traveled into the past, it would not have been visible when we came first into this room, or last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so forth. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor. With an air of impartiality, turning towards the time traveler. Not a bit, said the time traveler. And to a psychologist, you think you can explain that? It's presentation below the threshold, you know. Diluted presentation. Oh, welcome, Pastel. Today, the book I'm reading is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. How have you been today? I'm aware that you're currently 6 hours ahead, so it's 9 o'clock for here. I don't believe it's around 12, which I believe is a normal time you sleep, yes, Pastel. But I do hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm going to read a bit more of this page and I'll look back at chat. Of course, said the psychologist, and reassured us. That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough, and it helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor hear, nor can we appreciate this machine, any more than we can see the spoke of a wheel spinning, or the bullet flying through the air. If it is traveling through time 50 times or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression it creates will of course be only 1/50th or 100th of what we would make of it if we are not traveling in time. Okay. Alright, just eating dinner. Well, that's good to hear, Also, Sabrina, are you still awake? I want to know if you're sleeping yet, hon. That's plain enough, he said. He passed his hand. Through the space which the machine had been, you see, he said, laughing. We sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so. Then the time traveler asked us what we thought of it all. It sounds plausible enough tonight, said the medical man. But wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. Hmm. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the time traveler. And there within, or therewith, taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long, draughty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer, broad head in silhouette, the dance of the shadows, how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how there in the laboratory we behold a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish before our eyes. Parts of nickel, parts of ivory, parts had certainly been filled or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look at it. Quartz, it seemed to be. Look there, said the medical man. Are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas? Upon that machine, said the time traveler, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life. None of us knew how to take it. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man, and he winked at me solemnly. Chapter 2. I think that at that time none of us quite believed in the time machine. The fact is, the time traveler was one of those men who were too clever to be believed. He never felt that you saw all around him. You always suspected some subtle reverse, some ingenuity in ambush behind his lucid frankness. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter of the time traveler's words, we should have shown him far less skepticism, for we should be perceived, for we should have perceived his motives. A pork butcher would understand Philby, but the time traveler is more than a touch of whim in his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the frame of a less clever man seem tricks in his hands. It is a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously never quite felt sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with eggshell china. So I don't think if any of us said very much about time traveling. In the interval between that Thursday and the next, though its odd propensities ran. No doubt in most of our minds, it's plausibly, that is, its practical incredibleness, the curious possibilities of anarchism, and of utter confusion suggested. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model, that I remember discussing with the medical man whom I met on Friday at the Linzane. He said he had seen a similar thing in Tübingen, and laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle, and how the trick was done, but he could not explain. The next Thursday I went out to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveler's most constant guests, and arriving late, found 4 to 5 men assembled in his drawing room. The medical man was standing before the fire with a sheet of paper in one hand and his watch in the other. I looked around for the time mission traveler, and "It's 7:30 now," said the medical man. "I suppose it's better we'd have dinner." "Where's—" I said, naming our host. "You've just come. It's rather odd," he unavoidably detained. He asked me in his note to lead off with the dinner at 7, if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes. "It seems a pity to let the dinner spoil," said the editor of a well-known daily paper, and therefore the doctor rang the bell. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who attended the previous dinner, and other men were blank. The editor, aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another quiet, shy man with a beard, whom I didn't know, and who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth at all the evening. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveler's absence, and I suggested time traveling in a half-jocular spirit. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed that day week. He was in the midst of his exposition when the door from the corridor opened slowly and without noise. I was facing the door and saw it first. "Hello," spelled with an H, or Hallo. Interesting. Maybe an archaic form, perhaps, I said at last, and the door opened wider and the time traveler stood before us. I gave a cry of surprise. "Good heavens, man, what's the matter?" cried the medical man, who saw him next, and the whole tableful turned towards the door. He was in an amazing plight. His coat was dusty and dirty and smeared with green down his sleeves, his hair disordered, and as it seemed to me grayer, either of dust, dirt, or because his color had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, A cut half healed, his expression was haggard and drawn, as by intense suffering. For a moment he hesitated in the doorway, as if he'd been dazzled by the light. Then he came into the room. He walked with just a limp, as I have seen on footsore tramps. We stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. The other filled the glass of champagne and pushed it towards him. He drained it, and it seemed to do him good. He looked around at the table, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. "What on earth have you been up to, man?" said the doctor. The time traveler did not seem to hear. "Don't let me disturb you," he said with certain false articulation. "I'm all right." He stopped, held out his glass for more, and took it off at a draught. "That's good," he said. His eyes grew brighter, and a faint color came to his cheeks. His glance flickered over our faces with a certain dull approval, and then we went round the warm and comfortable room. Then he spoke again, still as if it were fading, or feeling his way amongst his words. "I'm going to wash and dress, and then I'll come down and explain things. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat." He looked across at the editor, who was a rare visitor, and hoped he was all right. The editor began a question. "Tell you presently," said the time traveler. "I'm funny. Be all right in a minute." He put down his glass and walked towards the staircase door. Again, I remarked his lameness and the soft padding sound of his footfall, and standing up in my place I saw his feet as he went out. He had nothing on them but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. Then the door closed upon him. I had half a mind to follow him, till I remembered how he detested any fuss about himself. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool gathering. Then remarkable behavior of an eminent scientist. I heard the editor say, "thinking," in his headlines, and this brought my attention back to the bright dinner table. "What's the game?" said the journalist. "Has he been doing the amateur cadger?" I don't follow. I let the man eye the psychologist and read my own interpretation of his face. I followed the time traveler, limping painfully upstairs, but I don't think of anyone else who had noticed his lameness. The first to recover completely from his surprise was the medical man, who rang the bell. The time traveler hated to have servants waiting at dinner for a hot plate. Hmm. At that, the editor turned to his knife and fork with a grunt, and the silent man followed suit. The dinner was resumed. Conversation was exclamatory for a little while of gapes of wonderment. Then the editor got ferment in his curiosity. "Does our friend eke out his modest income with a crossing? Or has he his Nebuchadnezzar phases?" he inquired. "I feel sure that it's business. It's his business a time machine," I said. And I look up to the psychologist's account of our previous meeting. The new guests were frankly incredulous. The editor raised objections. What is this time traveling? A man couldn't cover himself with dust by rolling in a paradox, could he? And then, as the idea came home to him, he resorted to caricature. Hadn't they any clothes brushes in the future? The journalist, too, would not believe any price, and joined the editor in his easy work of heaping ridicule on the whole thing. They were both the new kind of journalist, very joyous, irrelevant young men. Our special correspondent in the day after tomorrow reports. The journalist was saying, or rather shouting, when the time traveler came back. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, evening clothes that is, and nothing save his haggard look remained of the change that he had startled me. "I say," said the editor hilariously, "these chaps here say you have been travelling to the middle of next week. Tell us all about your little Rosebery, will you? What will you take for the lot?" And the time traveler came to the place reserved for him without a word. He smiled quietly in his old way. "Where's my mutton?" he said. What a treat to stick a fork into meat again. "Story!" cried the editor. "Story be damned," said the time traveler. "I want something to eat, and I won't say a word until I get some preptone into my arteries. Thanks, and the salt." "One word," said I. "Have you been time traveling?" "Yes," said the time traveler with his mouth full, nodding his head. "I'd give a shilling a line for a verbatim note," said the editor. The time traveler pushed his glass towards the silent man and rang it with his fingernail, at which the silent man, who had been staring at his face, started convulsively and poured him wine. The rest of the dinner was uncomfortable. For my own part, sudden questions kept on rising to my lips, and dare say it, was the same with other questions. The journalist tried to relieve the tension by telling anecdotes of Hetty Potter. The time traveler devoted his attention to his dinner and displayed the appetite of a tramp. The medical man smoked a cigarette and watched the time traveler through his eyelashes. The silent man seemed more clumsy than usual and drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. At last, the time traveler pushed his plate away and looked around at us. "I suppose I must apologize," he said. "I was simply starving, and I had the most amazing time." He reached his hand out for a cigar and cut the end. "But come into the smoking room. It's too long to tell a story over greasy plates." And ringing the bell in passing, he led the way into the adjoining room. "You have told Blank and Dash and Chose about the machine," he said to me, leaning back in his easy chair and naming the three new guests. "The thing's a mere paradox," said the editor. "I can't argue tonight. I don't mind telling you the story, but I can't argue." "I will," he went on, "tell you the story of what has happened to me, if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Most of all, it will sound like lying, but so be it. It's true, every word of it. All the same, I was in my laboratory for at 4 o'clock. Since then, I lived 8 days. Days as no human has ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shouldn't sleep until I've told this thing over to you. Then I shall go to bed, but no interruptions. Is that agreed?" "Agreed," said the editor, and the rest of us echoed agreed. And with that the time traveler began his story. As I have set it forth, he sat back in his chair at first, and spoke like a weary man. Afterwards he got more animated. In writing it down, I feel with only too much keenness the inadequacy. I'm getting a bit tired. Sorry about that. Inadequacy of pen and ink, and above all, my own inadequacy, to express its quality. You read, I will suppose, attentively enough, but you cannot see the speaker's white, sincere face in the bright circle of a little lamp, nor hear the intonation of his voice. You cannot know how his expression followed the turns of his story. Most of us hearers were in shadow, for the candles in the smoking room had not been lighted, and only the face of the journalist and the legs of the silent man from knees downward were illuminated. At first we glanced now and again at each other. After a time we ceased to do so and looked only at the time traveler's face. Chapter 3. I told some of you last Thursday of the principles of the time machine, and I showed you the actual thing itself, incomplete, in the workshop. There it is now, little travel-worn truly, and one of the ivory bars is cracked, and a brass rail bent, but the rest of it's sound enough. I expected to finish on Friday, but on Friday, when the putting together was nearly done, I found that one of the nickel bars was exactly 1 inch too short. And this I had to get remade, so that the thing was not complete until this morning. It was 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last trip, tried all the screws again, and put one more drop of oil in the quartz rod, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose the suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other, pressed the first, and almost immediately the second. I began to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking around, I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment I suspected my intellect had tricked me. Then I noted the clock. The moment before, as it seemed, it had stood there at a minute or so 10 past. Now it is nearly 3:30. I drew a breath, set my teeth, gripped the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Miss Watchett came in, walked, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse the place. But to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position. The night came like turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, then fainter, then even fainter. Tomorrow night came black, then day again, then night again, then day again, faster and faster still. An eddying murmur filled my ears, and strange, dumb confusedness descended on my mind. I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. They were excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like the one has sat upon a switchback of a helpless headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation, too, of an immediate smash. As I put on pace, night followed the day, like the flapping of a black wing. The dim suggestion of the laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute, and every minute marking a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed, and I had come into the open air. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, but I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things, and the slowest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. The twinkling sensation of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. Then, in the intermittent darkness, I saw the moon spinning swiftly her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, the palpitation night and day merged into one continuous grayness. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous color like that of early twilight. The jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arc in space. The moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing in the stars save now that a brighter circle flickering in the blue. The landscapes was misty and vague. It was still an hillside upon which the house now stands, and shoulder rose above me, gray and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapor. Now brown, now green, they grew and spread and shivered and passed away. I saw huge buildings rise up and faint, pass like dreams. The whole surface of the earth seemed to change, melting and flowing under my eyes. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed raced round faster and faster. Presently I noted that sunbelt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less. That consequently my pace was over a year a minute, and a minute by minute the snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright, brief green of spring. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They merged at last into some kind of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked indeed a clumsy swaying of the machine, for which I was unable to account, but my mind was too confused to attend to it. So, with a kind of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. At first, I scarce thought of stopping, scarce enough of anything but these new sensations. But presently a fresh series of impressions grew up in my mind, a certain curiosity and therefore a certain dread, until at last they took a certain possession of mine. What strange developments of humanity! What a wonderful advances upon our rudimentary civilization, I thought. It might not appear when I came to look nearly into the dim, elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. I saw great splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our own time, and yet, as it seemed, built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there, without any wintry intermission. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair. And so my mind came round to the business of stopping. The peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied. So long as I traveled at high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was so to speak, attenuated, was slipping like a vapor for the interstices of intervening substances. But to come to a stop involved a jamming of myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my way, meaning bringing my atoms into intimate contact with those of an obstacle. What a profound chemical reaction! Possibly the far-reaching explosion would result. Blow myself and my apparatus all out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while I was making the machine, but then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk, one of the risks a man has got to take. Now that the risk was inevitable, I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. The fact is that, insensibly, the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all, the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerve. I told myself that could never stop, and with a gust of petulance, I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I lugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over. I was floating headlong for the air. There was the sound of a clap of thunder in my ears, and I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing around me, and I was sitting on surf turf in front of the overset machine. Everything still seemed a bit gray. But presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked around me. I was on what seemed to be a little lawn in a garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes, and I noticed that the mauve and the purple blossoms were dropping in a shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like smoke. In a moment I was wet to the skin. Fine hospitality, I said, to a man who has traveled innumerable years to see you. Presently I thought what a fool I was to get wet. I stood up and looked around me. A colossal figure, carved apparently in some white stone, loomed indistinctly beyond the rhododendrons through the hazy downpour. But all else of the world was inevitable. Hailstones piled along their courses. I felt naked in a strange world. I felt as perhaps a bird may feel the clear air, knowing the hawk wings above and will swoop. My fear grew into frenzy. I took a breathing space, set my teeth, and began grappling fiercely, wrist and knee, with the machine. I gave it under my desperate onset and turned it over. It struck my chin violently. One hand on the saddle and the other one on the lever. I stood panting heavily in the attitude to melt again. But with this recovery of a prompt retreat, my courage recovered. I took more curiously and less fearfully at this world, this of the remote future. A circular opening high up on the wall of a near house. I saw a group of figures clad in rich white robes. They had seen me, and their faces were directed towards me. Then I heard voices approaching me, coming through the bushes by the white sphinx, were the heads and shoulders of men running. One of these emerged into a pathway leading straight to the little lawn which I stood in with my machine. He was a slight creature, perhaps 4 feet high, clad in a purple tunic, gilded at the waist with a leather belt, sandals or bushkins. I cannot clearly distinguish which were on his feet. His legs were bare to the knees and his head was bare. Notice that. I noticed the first time how warm the air was. He struck me as being a very beautiful and graceful creature, but indescribably frail. His flushed face reminded me of the more beautiful kind of consumptive, the heretic beauty of which we used to hear so much. At the sight of him, I suddenly gained confidence, and I took my hands from the machine. I do hope you enjoyed that today. And hello, Makoto darling. I'm afraid I'm about to end stream. It's been hours' time, and I thank each and every one of you for showing up. I do wish you a wonderful time, and I might perhaps raid out, or I might not. But I thank each and every one of you for showing up. I love you all. Do have a wonderful day now.